This is a series of videos on common student errors that students can go to and look at ways in which these errors can be examined in papers, especially for a college composition course. But this video is the start of this series, and it's going to focus on some tips for revision and editing and proofreading during your revision. So you can use these tips with any of the other videos and refer back to these tips when you're watching those other videos. So first I want to go over quickly thinking about editing versus proofreading. When I think about these, I'm not thinking about copy editing like you would talk about if you were doing a newspaper or something like that, but I'm looking at editing as like once I've done and written my paper or my project, whatever I'm working on, I go back and I look over the whole thing. So I re-see it. Editing and proofreading are both part of revision, right? That re-seeing idea. But in editing, I start out by looking at, are things organized correctly? Do I have an argument? What's my supporting evidence like? Things like that are what I'm looking for. Those are what we call higher order concerns. I want to make sure I am addressing the correct audience, the purpose, I'm using the right genre, I'm looking at the requirements if it's an assignment or the needs of it if it's something beyond just an assignment for class, and making sure I'm meeting all those requirements. Proofreading, on the other hand, are those lower order concerns. Their clarity, word choice, consistency, am I concise? Those are what we would call standard writing conventions. We do this last, and this series of videos really gets into the proofreading because we talk about the editing aspects more so during class, when we're doing sort of peer review, when we're getting feedback on our work before we turn it in. So this goes over some of those standard writing conventions and proofreading work, but I want to talk about both for a little while. So I want to give you some tips for thinking about editing, but I also want to make sure that you have that proofreading and ways in which you can do the proofreading. So just in general, some things to keep in mind when you're doing any kind of revision. You want to try and write, and if possible, give yourself a break between your writing and revision. So this means don't write something 5 minutes or 10 minutes or an hour before class. Try and give yourself at least a day where you can write it, put it aside, and come back to it. It gives you sort of fresh eyes. It lets you see it differently. Decide what medium is best to help you proofread and edit. Some people need to print out their paper and they need to look at it, which is what I do when I'm doing revision, right? I need to print it out. I need to look at it that way. Other people, it's fine doing it on their phone or on the computer. So think about what you need best. Use feedback that you've gotten, whether it's from your classmates, whether it's from a professor or teacher. Think about the feedback you've already gotten. Read those comments that you got in other work and use that feedback to help you when you're revising your work as you move forward. Another suggestion I have, especially when it comes to proofreading, is focus on one error at a time. So think about an error and look for that, and then go and look for the next one, or look for just, even if you're doing the higher order concerns, look if you just want to look to make sure you have, first start out by going through looking if you have good supporting evidence. So thinking about it in those ways. Typical errors. Know what your typical errors are. Ask yourself, what do you struggle with when you write? This helps if you're going back and looking at feedback you've already gotten. Keep a list of it. So write it down somewhere, have a file on your computer, on your phone, whatever you're doing, so you can refer to it. If you know that you struggle with capitalization, or if you know there's certain words, if you don't know the difference between it's with an apostrophe and it's without an apostrophe, write all those down so you can reference it as you move forward and know you need to look for those. And check yourself. Like I said, give your time to check for those errors before you turn in your work. So at the very least, know there's 2 or 3 things you really need to make sure you look for in your work, and do that. Before I move into really thinking about proofreading, I just want to give you something from Kelly Gallagher that I really like. He calls it Radar, to help you do that editing revision. And this is going through your paper 3 or 4 times and looking for the following. Where can you replace things? Words that are overused, they're not specific, are there unclear sentences? There's something needs to be replaced. Then, like, can you add detail somewhere? Do you need to describe something? You could think about adding detail also by putting in quotes, putting in examples, anything like that. Are there things you have to delete? Are there things that are repeating themselves? Do you have paragraphs that repeat themselves? Do you have ideas that aren't really related to the topic that you need to remove? Do you have this great sentence, but it doesn't really work in the paper? Delete that. And how can you reorder things? So how can you put things in order to make it flow better, to have solid details that are supported, thinking about those things. So as you go through thinking about replacing, adding, deleting, and reordering can really help you as you revise. So when you move to proofread, here are some things I would suggest you do. One thing that can really help you find those errors, sort of proofread through your paper, is to change how your document looks. So alter something in it. Make a bigger font, make a smaller font, make it all green. Change the spacing. So if you write it all in single space, turn it into double space. Change the style of it in some way. So make the document really look different. If you do this, it can help you to see it in a different way. It can help you pretend you're not reading your paper. It gives you sort of fresh eyes. You're not looking at the same thing over and over and over. This is one reason some people like to print their documents out, because then they're sort of looking at it in a different space. So change your document up as you do this. Another thing that can really help is to read backwards. If you're reading backwards, start either at the last. Some people do it sentence by sentence, so read the last sentence, then the second to the last, and keep reading. Some people do it paragraph by paragraph, right? Line by line. But in doing this, it forces you to look at each sentence instead of reading it and skipping over sentences or skipping over words that your mind has sort of already seen. You have to pay attention to each line. And this might help you find those issues, find those concerns and errors that you have throughout your paper. Another thing that can really help with proofreading is to focus on the paragraph. So look at each paragraph individually. Sometimes I tell students to take on each paragraph, write on the side of the paragraph what the main idea of that paragraph is. Make sure it's constructed and correctly so you have a topic sentence and supporting sentences. If you don't have that, if you can't find the main idea of the paragraph, then maybe you need to do some revision to it. Look at the length. Is the paragraph 1 or 2 sentences? Does that make it a well-constructed and detailed, really meaty paragraph, or do you need to add to that? Is your paragraph focused on one thought, one idea, or does it have a number of them in there? Is it a long paragraph? Is your paper 3 pages and 1 paragraph? Paragraphs are important to give readers a break, to alert readers that you're moving on to a new topic. And so look at that. Where could you break that long paragraph up? So really focus on the paragraphs, look at the paragraphs and think about what you can do in each of them. That also helps too. If you have a longer paper, you could say, I'm just going to look at 3 paragraphs. I have 10-15 minutes. I'm going to look at 3 paragraphs, and then you can come back and look at the next 3 paragraphs, and it's breaking the paper up too. So if you focus on paragraphs, it makes it a little more manageable as well. Read it aloud. So this suggestion comes up all the time. If you read it slowly, if you read every single word, if you read it in your head, I know it sounds crazy to read aloud. It sounds sort of weird to do. Sometimes you don't want to listen to yourself read aloud. But if you read it aloud instead of in your head, you have to hear every word. That way, if it's awkward, if it's hard for you to read aloud, you know that maybe you need to change that sentence. You need to change that paragraph. There's words in there that really don't make sense, right? If you stop and pause somewhere and think, what did I write? That again tells you maybe you need to go back and revise it. Have your friend, your roommate, someone else you know, read it to you and follow along. See where they do the same thing. Where is it awkward for them? Where might they pause? All these things can really help you in doing your proofreading. Another thing, if you struggle with punctuation, and this might seem really difficult or it might seem like it might take a long time, and again, if you do it paragraph by paragraph, it would be different. But if you go through and circle every single punctuation mark, that might really help you as well. You can look at each one then, so just go through and circle them, and then look at them. So circle every comma, circle every period, every colon and semicolon, exclamation mark, question mark. Just make sure they're correct. Do you need them? Is that period really where it needs to be? If you do you have a sentence that has both a subject and a verb agreement in it? So go through and look for those things. Look for the punctuation marks. And lastly, there's nothing wrong with asking for help. Ask your professor. So ask me for help. I am more than willing to help you. Ask the Writing Center. Go to the Writing Center. Use the University Writing Center. You all have access to it and you can use it. Ask your peers. If you have a friend in class or someone you can go to, ask them. Ask someone you trust as a writer. So when I am working on my work, I'm always asking for help. I always send it out and ask someone who I trust as a writer to read through it, both for all my revisions. So for editing, I ask, and I even have certain friends I know do really well with proofreading. I ask them to proofread too. So think about asking for help. This is not something that you can do really easily right away. It takes some time, but the more you practice it, the better you get at it. So think about these things. Use these at least for one semester, but I hope for the rest of your time, use these tips and tricks to really help you as you move forward. And as you watch the other videos in this series, return to this video to think about how you can incorporate some of this knowledge and some of what you learned in some of those other videos into your writing and into your work and revision, especially your work in proofreading.